Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Today we are going to analyze the Hindu dated 1st of April 2020. Displayed on the screen is a list of articles that we are going to discuss today. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description of the video. Let's begin our analysis. Page number 7 of today's newspaper presents an article which talks about the cost of the cure of the COVID. Now, this topic is important from the perspective of patent regime, and hence it is important from the perspective of science and technology, and it will also touch upon the issue of health. Now, in this context, let's first try to understand what author wants to put across. The author is actually trying to highlight that in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, as and when there is any drug available, we need to pay attention to the Indian patent regime as well in terms of ensuring the availability of drug for the masses. Now in this context, author has highlighted few very important points. First, WHO has declared the COVID-19 outbreak as a pandemic. However, when you talk about the United States Food and Drug Administration, that has declared COVID-19 as an orphan disease. Now, in this context, it is very important for us to understand what is orphan disease. Orphan disease is one which is considered to be a rare disease, and according to the Orphan Drug Act of the US, if any disease is considered as an orphan disease, it means that treatment for these diseases will come under the purview of rare diseases. And this will change the complexion of the entire discussion that we are going to talk about. At the same time, we'll talk about this issue when we talk about the COVID-19 and the Orphan Drug Act. Next important aspect is the provisions of compulsory licensing for the drugs which is available in India. And when we talk about the COVID-19, when such a vaccine or a drug is available for the treatment, how compulsory licensing can actually benefit Indian people in this context. So the idea is to understand as and when drug is available in the market, how this drug can be made available to the people. In this context, it is important for us to understand the relationship between the COVID-19 and the Orphan Drug Act. Now, in simple terms, in the US, under the Orphan Drug Act of 1983, companies are provided with the incentives to develop therapies or orphan drugs for rare diseases. This act further goes on to explain what is a rare disease. A rare disease is one which infects less than 2 lakh people, and in case even if a disease infects more than 2 lakh people, then also if there is no chance of recovering the R&D cost of creating the drug, then also this disease may be bracketed under the rare disease. So in a nutshell, when we talk about any kind of drug or medicine which is available for COVID-19, according to the US, this drug will be considered something which treats rare disease. Rare disease in terms of numbers, and if numbers don't satisfy, then if there is a chance of not recovering the R&D cost, then also this can be considered as a rare disease. Now, how it is going to impact licenses on the drugs? Now, since the new drugs which are yet to be developed will be considered as Orphan Drug Act, they will have exclusivity in terms of making the drug, at the same time charging money according to their requirement. Another important aspect is that generic medicine manufacturers will not be in a position to market the drug to treat COVID-19 with the same active ingredient till the 7-year period of market exclusivity has ended. This gives the original manufacturer a free rein on pricing and licensing, which has disastrous consequences on the healthcare system of the country as such. Now we have understood about Orphan Drug Act, we have understood about impact on such licenses on drugs. Now let's focus upon how it is going to impact India. Now when we talk about the kind of treatment that is going to be available, especially in India for the COVID-19, Gilead Sciences holds a patent in India which is likely to claim for this use, and hence the possible drug will become prohibitively expensive for common man. So this is the background of the entire article which the author highlights in terms of the cost of a cure for COVID-19. And in this sense, the author highlights what kind of a mechanism that is available for people in India in order to solve this problem. So, what is the mechanism available in India to ensure that public gets the access to the drugs? As we have seen that according to the Orphan Drug Act of 1983, the drugs can become prohibitively expensive as they are considered to be rare drugs. Now, in this context, it is important for you to know that Indian law permits government to issue compulsory license in the certain circumstances under Section 84 and Section 92 of the Patents Act. According to the provisions highlighted above, third parties are allowed to manufacture patented drugs without the permission of the patent holder. Now, in this context, it is important for us to know that Indian companies have already expressed their capability to manufacture the drug. The firepower under this provision has never been deployed before. However, if the government does not exercise its power to issue compulsory license if required, Indian manufacturer would not be able to manufacture generic, that is without challenging the patent, and this would leave hundreds and thousands of people vulnerable to jillied pricing policy and licensing contagion. So, in simple words, we can say that if the government has to maintain supply of medicine at an affordable price to the masses in India, then they have to basically resort to the mechanism of compulsory licensing. Otherwise, this entire scenario will become unmanageable for the Indian government. Now, in this context, let's try to understand the basic idea about what is compulsory licensing. Under a compulsory license, an individual or a company seeking to use another's intellectual property can do so without seeking the right holder's consent and pays the right holder a set fee for the license. Second part is this is an exception to the general rule under the intellectual property laws that the intellectual property owner enjoys exclusive right that it may license or decline to license to other. At the same time, as we can see from the provisions of this compulsory license, this has to be used with great caution. Now, one of the primary benefits that we can highlight about compulsory licensing is that it ensures availability of medicine to masses. At the same time, there are other benefits as well. First is innovation. Now, in underdeveloped countries, the innovation of pharmaceutical companies will be less, as they will prefer getting the compulsory license to generic drug rather than funding the research and development separately, which is often very costly. So, in this sense, we can say that it is going to save the cost factor. Second important aspect is research based pharmaceutical companies will not launch patent module in the developing countries as there is always a risk of losing patent and losing money in research. Now, when we talk about the benefits of compulsory licensing, it will definitely benefit the generic drug manufacturers. At the same time, when we talk about the innovation in terms of pharmaceutical companies, this innovation will not be promoted because of the provisions of the compulsory licensing. Second important aspect is compulsory licensing will increase the number of companies producing generic medicines. In this fashion, the supply will go up and the cost will come down. But one of the problems is this will also force the innovator countries or the companies to introduce differential pricing of their patent module so that they can stand in the market. And in an extreme scenario, it is possible that they do not position their drug altogether. Third benefit of compulsory licensing is to the patients. Patients will get medicines at a significantly cheaper rates. Now, since we are talking about IPR as well as the compulsory license, so in this context, we need to focus about TRIPS under WTO as well. Now, India has definitely signed TRIPS agreement at WTO. At the same time, it has aligned its IPR laws with the TRIPS, which in itself allows for the compulsory licensing. Now, as per the WTO TRIPS norms, it mentions the grounds on which compulsory licenses can be given. First is, of course, the national emergency, and second is the other circumstances of extreme urgency. At the same time, it is important here to highlight that WTO has clearly stated that each member has a sovereign right to decide the grounds for the grant of compulsory licenses. So, in the essence, TRIPS has balanced the IPR with those of the national interest. So, when we talk about this particular scenario, the provisions of TRIPS under WTO are not going to be impeding into the compulsory licenses in this case. However, there's another important aspect that we need to focus upon, and that is the global perspective on compulsory licensing. Now, when we talk about global perspective, that perspective is divided between developed versus developing countries. The phenomena of compulsory licenses is hugely debated issue, and the debate basically favors those who hold the patents. Many developing countries are giving importance to compulsory licensing because of the unavailability and unaffordability of the medicines, and they are continuously granting more and more compulsory licensing to provide better healthcare services to their citizens. The developed countries of Europe, USA are opposing this view as it would make innovations difficult for the pharmaceutical companies. At the same time, their primary objective is to maximize the profit for the cost they have incurred in terms of developing the medicine. So, in this context, what can be other major challenges that India might face in terms of granting the compulsory licensing for the medicine for the COVID? In this case, United States Special 301 report may come into the way of India's journey. According to this report, the US has termed India as one of the world's most challenging major economies with respect to protection and enforcement of intellectual property. This is mainly because India made a policy of issuing compulsory license for life-threatening disease. Now, this particular attitude of the US is basically fueled by India's case of granting compulsory license in 2012 to an Indian company called Natco Pharma for generic production of Bayer Corporation's Nexavar. The government took this decision to produce this generic medicine for the general public benefit. However, it was heavily criticized by the pharmaceutical companies as they felt the license should not have been given. At the same time, Natco Pharma, which is an Indian company, is paying the royalties to the Bayer at the rate of 6% of all the sales on the quarterly basis in accordance to the guidelines set by the United Nations Development Program. So we can see that there has been a lot of debate in terms of availability of medicine and what kind of compulsory licensing different countries may adopt. At the same time, we need to see how things actually turn up once the drug has been developed. Page number 9 of today's newspaper talks about important information which says that Supreme Court upholds the right to discuss COVID-19. Now, in this context, it is important for us to understand that Supreme Court has upheld the right to free discussion about COVID-19 and directed the media to refer to and publish the government version of the development in order to avoid any kind of inaccuracies and large scale panic. In this context, the Supreme Court has ordered the government to start a daily bulletin on COVID-19 developments through all media avenues in next 24 hours. Now, this news is important for us in terms of 2-3 perspective. The first and foremost, why government has imposed restrictions on the media houses in terms of discussing COVID-19. Second is Supreme Court's take on restrictions which have been put by the government. And third is steps taken to handle queries in public. Now, in this context, let's try to understand this information one by one. First and foremost is what did the government want from the media houses on COVID-19 discussion? Now, the first thing that we need to understand is that central government has requested media houses to only publish or telecast anything on COVID-19 after ascertaining it in terms of its factual position from the government. So, in this context, we can say that the onus lies on the media houses to get the facts right about the COVID-19. Now, according to the government, this was done to avoid telecasting of any deliberate or inaccurate reporting by media houses. Now, it is important to understand that in order to handle epidemic like corona, it is very important to stop rumor mongering or spread of rumor from various sources. And it has been seen that at times media channels are also responsible for rumor mongering. In this context, the government wants to put restriction on these kind of media channels that they should not publish or telecast any information without ascertaining the true facts with the government agencies. Now, the expectation of the government from these media houses is to actually not to create panic during this time of disaster, and this is also a criminal offense under the Disaster Management Act of 2005. As we have seen that as more and more information came out in the public resorted to stocking of goods and supplies, which led to buying spree in the market, and this has caused shortage of supply in terms of home groceries, medicines, and many other similar goods like hand sanitizers and masks. Central government has actually blamed irresponsible media houses for the widespread panic that has been caused in the people who come from the lower strata of the society. And this has led to mass barefoot journey of migrant workers from the cities to their native villages. Now, in this context, it is important for us to understand that Section 54 deals with the punishment of false warning. So we can see that what government actually wants from this curve is to circulate information which is verified. At the same time, there is a problem that the verification onus basically rests with the media houses or the publishing companies. In this context, this is not a balanced approach. And in this context, Supreme Court has also answered to this problem by defining that there should be a daily bulletin on COVID-19, which actually caters to all the avenues of the media. This would ensure one-stop solution in terms of all the informational needs of media houses, and this will be instrumental in curbing the rumors, and chances of creating panic about the disaster will be much more controlled in its nature. Now this takes us to the second important aspect. What was Supreme Court's response on the central government's approach? Now, the Supreme Court's response in terms of the curbs which are imposed by the central government are more balanced in nature. The court did not agree completely with the central government in terms of the curbs imposed, and rather took a balanced view considering freedom of press and the need to avoid panic in the society during this unprecedented crisis. At the same time, the court highlighted that it is the responsibility of the media houses to keep the general public informed, and they are expected to work hand in hand with the government of India. In this context, the court asked all kinds of media, print, electronic, or social, to maintain a strong sense of responsibility and ensure that unverified news capable of causing mass panic is not published irresponsibly, and ensure that unverified which are capable of causing mass panic are not published. The court says it is the responsibility of the media to inform public with the correct facts. At the same time, the onus cannot entirely lie with the media only. In order to solve the problem of getting information from the right channel, the Supreme Court allowed a daily bulletin on COVID-19 situation, which is to be released by the Government of India through all media avenues. This includes all type of social medias and forum, and this will be utilized to clear doubts in the mind of the people. Now the daily bulletin will be made active within a period of 24 hours. The court also expressed the opinion that the right information is the key to fight against coronavirus epidemic. And in this context, the government should come up with daily bulletin in next 24 hours so as to ensure that right information is fed to these media houses. The idea of daily bulletin on COVID-19 situation to be released by the union government was submitted by the Solicitor General of India. Now let us try to understand the reasons for setting up a separate unit for handling the queries of the public. Now we know that because of the recent rumors about the kind of coronavirus epidemic that we are facing, there has been a mass movement of people from their working places to their homes and villages. In this context, the entire purpose of lockdown is defeated by such kind of a movement. At the same time, it is also very important to maintain supplies as because of the rumor mongering and because of the panic created by various media houses, people have purchased more for the difficult times. And in this context, we have seen that this kind of a situation has caused lot of problems in terms of maintaining the supplies of essential commodities in our places. And hence, fake news or inaccurate information circulated in the media can create panic in the mind of the people, and this panic has created hindrance for the government to meet the challenges posed on different fronts. And this is what government has tried in terms of putting restrictions on media houses, that they should circulate information which is verified by the government only. Second important aspect is, which court has also highlighted, that right information is key to fight any kind of pandemic, be it coronavirus epidemic. In this context, to provide accurate information to public, the government aims to set up separate unit headed by joint secretary level officer in the health ministry and consisting of eminent specialist doctors from recognized institutions like aims to answer queries of citizen. In this context, this kind of channel will bring a lot of value and reliability in terms of providing the right set of information to the people. And this in long run will ensure that the kind of information that the people receive is verified, and this will actually stop panic and rumor mongering among the public. Page number 11 of today's newspaper highlights a very important news item which talks about China chases Indonesia's fishing fleet staking claim to seize riches. Now, this topic is important from the perspective of international relation, and hence it is very important from the perspective of mains examination. At the same time, this topic is also very important from the perspective of prelims examination on account of two things. First, as we have seen in the recent past, UPSC has asked many map-based questions in which countries, locations and seas have been asked. In this context, this particular news item is very important from the perspective of prelims examination. At the same time, when we talk about this particular issue, the second important fact is it comes under international issues of importance, and hence again this is very important from the perspective of prelims organization. There are many conventions like UN clause that we should know from the perspective of prelims examination. So let's focus on this topic. The first question that we need to answer in this context is, which countries are involved in the South China Sea dispute? So these countries include China, Vietnam, Malaysia, which is divided into islands as well, Indonesia, Philippines, and the small royalty of Brunei. So in this context, these are the countries which are basically involved in this dispute with China in terms of control over these sea routes. So in terms of China's claim, these 9 dashes which are circled now are very important in terms of understanding China's claim. Now, China has supported its claim through two mechanisms. First, military might, and second is by making artificial islands in the region so as to ensure that it follows the UN clause norms as well. Now, when we talk about any kind of international debate, we will also expect US to participate. In this case, US has not taken any side because it is more of a territorial dispute, but at the same time, it has sent its military ships and planes near the disputed islands to ensure freedom of navigation operations, to ensure access to key shipping and air routes. So in this context, we can say that US has maintained more of a business orientation in this situation and has tried to avoid to get into any kind of territorial dispute in this region. Now, in this context, we need to understand what is the argument all about. Now, here on the map, you can see two islands. One is Paracels and second is Spratles. The actual dispute between these countries is over territory and sovereignty over ocean areas, and the Parcels and Spratleys, two island chains, are claimed in whole or in part by a number of countries. Apart from that, these countries have also claimed on Scarborough Shoal, etc., to ensure that they have an upper hand over others. Now, we need to understand what they are arguing about. Now, it is important for us to understand that the islands of Paracels and Spratles are largely inhabited, but at the same time, they have chances. But at the same time, they may have the resource. At the same time, they may have the reserves of natural resources around them. Now, natural resources around them is very important because according to the United Nations Convention, law on seas, 200 nautical miles of exclusive economic zone is maintained for the country in the vicinity. So we can see that Vietnam is located here and around 200 nautical miles is earmarked for Vietnam. Similar is the case with Malaysia, Indonesia, and Philippines. At the same time, when we talk about these 9 dash, which has been marked by China, this will extend China's domination to 2000 nautical miles. And this goes against the United Nations Convention law on seas. But at the same time, since this area is very rich in terms of natural resources, China has staked its claim and has created artificial islands. At the same time, it has also focused on other islands which have been uninhabited but at the same time can be utilized to stake a better claim for China. Another very important facet of this particular region is that this particular region is very important from the perspective of trade. Around $3.3 trillion of trade is done through these sea routes. And if we try to understand the total capacity in terms of trade and gas and reserves, this will turn out to around $5 trillion. Now, the countries which are there in the vicinity are trying to actually capture these natural resources for the economic development that they want for their country. And hence, China's and these countries' interests are in conflict. China claims by far the largest portion of the territory, an area defined by 9 dashed lines, and the circle that I have highlighted, which stretches hundreds of miles south and east from its southerly province of Hainan. Now, in order to stake its claim, China has utilized its past glorious history in which it has claimed that the islands of Paracels and Spratleys were part of the Chinese nation. It has showed two island groups, Paracels and Spratleys, falling entirely within its territory. Those claims are mirrored by Taiwan as well. Now, Vietnam has hotly disputed China's historical account, saying China had never claimed sovereignty over the islands before the 1940s. Vietnam says it has actively ruled over both Paracels and Spratleys since the 17th century and has the documents to prove it. So we can see that the countries which are there in the vicinity are fighting in terms of territory, which are important in terms of natural resources. Similarly, we can talk about Scarborough Shoal, which is claimed between Philippines and China. Now, we should also focus on the recent flashpoints which this area has seen. Now, this area has been troubled for decades, and China has maintained hostile relations with each of the neighboring states, be it Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Brunei, etc. Now, in this context, it is important for us to understand how China has staked claim on two island groups of Paracels and Spratleys. Now, in 1974, China seized parcels from Vietnam, and in this process, 70 Vietnamese soldiers lost their life. Similarly, in 1988, the two sides, China and Vietnam, clashed again for Spratleys, and Vietnam again came off worse, losing about 60 sailors. In early 2012, China and the Philippines engaged in a lengthy maritime standoff, accusing each other of intrusion in the Scarborough Shoal. If China occupies Scarborough Shoal, it will be only 500 kilometers from the Philippines, which is not good for a country in terms of maintaining its sovereignty and its strategic interest. In this context, Philippines has taken many actions. Manila is said to be taking China to the UN tribunal under the auspices of the UN Convention on the Law of Seas to challenge its claims. At the same time, China has not stopped its activity in the region. In May 2014, China started drilling rig in the water near the Paracel Islands, and this led to multiple collisions between the Vietnamese and the Chinese ships. So in this way, we can see that China has dominated the limelight in this particular case and has actually occupied islands from the smaller nations. Now, in this context, we need to understand if there is any kind of resolution that has been tried so far. Now, the point that China has made that China has always tried to enter into a bilateral negotiation with other parties. Now, considering the size in terms of economic and political might of China, other small countries cannot compete against the interests of China, and hence this has always been a lopsided negotiation. China used its clout to give itself an unfair advantage. Some of the countries in the region like Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, etc. have argued that China should negotiate with ASEAN, that is, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And in this fashion, the combined might of ASEAN may act as a counterweight to China's domination, and in this case, they could get a better deal for themselves. However, not only China has opposed it, but other members of ASEAN are also divided about how to negotiate with China, involving ASEAN in this case. In this sense, this entire topic is important from the perspective of prelims as well as mains examination, and we would suggest you to make notes ready for speedy revision. Page number 3 of today's newspaper has an advertisement which talks about celebrating 70 years of diplomatic relations between India and China. Now, in this context, it is important for us to know that on 1st of April 2020, India and China are celebrating 70th anniversary of establishment of the diplomatic relations. On this occasion, we must also inform you that India is one of the first countries to establish diplomatic relations with China. At the same time, when we talk about the relations between India and China, these relations are full of many ups and downs which are rooted from various internal and external factors. Now, due to overlapping interest, be it convergence or divergence, relationship between the two countries can be analyzed in terms of three C's. First is cooperation, second is conflict, and third is competition. Now, before we try to understand the relationship between these countries, let's first understand the basic dynamics. Both the countries are considered to be superpowers and are working very hard to ensure better quality of life for their citizens. Although their approach in terms of polity and governance is different, where China is more of a communist country and India is a democratic country, but at the same time, both the countries have done exceptionally well in terms of improving the quality of the life of their citizens. Now, in this context, let's focus first on cooperation part. Now, when we talk about India and China, both are Asian countries, both are developing countries, and hence there are more common points than the point of dissonance in terms of ensuring better cooperation. And the kind of cooperation that they have ensured has led to many far reaching positive benefits. First and foremost, we will talk about reform in the global governance architecture. Now, both India and China believe that global governance architecture in the form of international financial institutions such as IMF and World Bank, etc., are heavily dominated by the developed countries. This in turn leads to less representation to the developing economies. Both India and China have been cooperating with each other to reform IMF and World Bank so as to give more voting rights to the developing countries. They've also been demanding for the increase of IMF quotas for the developing economies. One of the most important themes which has dominated the international limelight in the recent past is climate change talks. These are very important considering the fact that many developed countries, which include US as well, have not been in a position to ensure that they do their quota of work in terms of reversing the climate change. In such a scenario, both India and China have upheld the principle of equity and CBDR in the climate change negotiation. At the same time, would like to highlight that both India and China have committed far more than their quota was. At the same time, the kind of efforts and the kind of resources that they have pooled is actually ensuring that these kind of climate change talks and their outcomes become positive in nature. Third important aspect is WTO trade negotiations. Now, as the world become much more globalized, there have been rising tendencies of protectionism, especially by the developed economies, and this has adversely impacted the global trade. The recent breakdown of WTO dispute settlement mechanism has further dealt a blow to the rules-based international trade. India and China see greater convergence in ensuring free and fair international trade. Both the countries are also considered to be leader of G33, a powerful bloc of developing countries in the WTO trade negotiations. So in this context, we can see that the kind of cooperation both the countries have shown, it actually has worked as a platform for other developing countries in terms of representing the ideas with the developed world. Next is the volatile security situation in Afghanistan. Now, all of us are aware of the fact that Afghanistan and Pakistan have emerged as epicenter of terrorism in the Indian subcontinent. This particular region poses security challenge to both India and China. At the same time, when we talk about the recent peace deal between the USA and Taliban, which calls for the greater cooperation between India and China to ensure peace and stability in the Afghan Pakistan region. In this sense, we can say that both India and China have shown greater resolve to ensure that security situation in Afghanistan improves and the kind of peace deal which Afghanistan government and Taliban are trying to negotiate that should be supported at the very first place. Apart from that, both the countries have started many development oriented projects in Afghanistan region to ensure that people of this particular region get a better life. Next important factor is common membership of international platform. Now, due to convergence of multiple interests in terms of number of spheres, India and China are part of number of international platforms. This includes BRICS, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, AIIB, G33, AIIB, BASIC, etc. Now, the kind of membership both the countries share actually show the kind of stature both the countries have in terms of importance for political and economic reasons. As we see today, the world is accepting both China and India as superpowers. And when we talk about superpowers, it is not about the military might, but also of economy, polity, and culture. Now, with this, we can move towards the next category, that is competition. Both India and China are world's most populous countries. Together, they man around 2.7 billion people. At the same time, both are also the fastest growing economies of the world, and they are also considered as the major driver of world's GDP growth. At the same time, when we talk about both India and China, they are very near in terms of proximity, and hence there are many areas of competition for both of them. The first such competition is economic competition. Now, when we talk about the size of economies, the size of Indian economy can be considered to be US dollar 2.9 trillion. At the same time, when we talk about the size of Chinese economy, it would be around US dollar 13.6 trillion. So, in terms of size, Chinese economy is much bigger than the Indian economy. However, in terms of growth rate, the performance of both the countries have been exemplary, and it has been normally compared in terms of ensuring transfer of economic benefits to its citizens. Both the countries are major destinations of foreign investment, and hence competition in terms of inviting more and more investment has also led to economic competition. Another important aspect is that when we talk about economy, Chinese economy is much bigger in scope and they have been a manufacturing hub. In this sense, they have become the largest trading partner of India as well. At the same time, when India has initiated Make in India campaign, this has also led to more of economic competition between these two countries. Now, the competition that we see between India and China is not limited in the economic sphere. It is also in terms of polity as well as the strategic interest. In this context, Indian Ocean region is a very important aspect. Both India and China are trying to expand their sphere of influence in Indian Ocean region. As part of Strings of Pearl, China has built ports in countries such as Pakistan, which is Gwadar, Sri Lanka, that is Hambantota, Bangladesh, which is Chittagong, etc. In response, the Indian government has also come out with Sagar initiative, that is security and growth for all in region, to combat growing influence of China in the Indian Ocean region. So we can see that when we talk about the competition, there are more dimensions apart from economic competition. Third important aspect in this case is engagement with neighborhood. Now, both the countries, India and China, have aspirations to become superpowers. At the same time, both the countries can become true superpowers only when they engage with the neighborhood. And hence, both India and China have been vying for higher political and economic influence in their neighboring countries such as Bangladesh, Myanmar, Nepal, etc. Next important aspect in terms of competition is engagement in the Indo Pacific region. Both the countries are competing in terms of economic as well as strategic interest, and in this case, this is reflected in the engagement in the Indo Pacific region as well. India has come out with Act East policy to promote multifaceted relation with East Asian economies with focus on Indo-Pacific region. On the other hand, China sees itself as a leader in the Indo-Pacific region. China has laid claim over the entire South China Sea that we have discussed in this analysis as well. And hence, it is involved in the maritime dispute with a number of Southeast Asian countries. Now, since China is engaged with boundary dispute with many East Asian countries, at the same time there are border disputes between India and China as well. So, this entire situation of engagement in Indo-Pacific region becomes much more fierce in nature. Now, let's focus upon the most important aspect in terms of India-China relations, that is conflict. At the same time, you must be aware of the fact that both India and China have engaged in a war as well. In this case, border dispute has been the primary sore between the two countries. The historical bonhomie, which was highlighted through Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, no longer exists. The 1954 Panchshil Treaty has failed to resolve their bilateral disputes. India and China are involved in border disputes as seen in the Chinese occupation of Aksai Chin. China has also staked claim over Arunachal Pradesh, and Doklam crisis has also reflected that territorial aggression is more of a policy for China, especially in case where interests of India are also considered. In this case, border dispute has led to many conflicts between India and China. Second cause of the conflict is CPEC corridor. Now, when you talk about CPEC corridor, it is an ambitious project of China. At the same time, Chinese involvement in CPEC corridor in Pakistan occupied Kashmir region has brought conflict between India and Pakistan into the fore. India believes that Chinese involvement is a threat to India's territorial integrity. At the same time, since China is developing CPEC corridor in Pakistan occupied Kashmir, it means China has accepted Pakistan occupied Kashmir as part of Pakistan, and this is a position which is not acceptable to India. Third important aspect in terms of conflict is China's support to Pakistan. It is normally said that enemy's enemy is a friend. At the same time, China sees Pakistan as its all-weather friend. China has been extending political, economic, and military support to Pakistan in order to contain India. The Indo-Pak conflict makes the Indian government more focused on the Indian subcontinent and prevents India from playing a more important role in the international level. So, in a way, multifaceted assistance to Pakistan is a clever ploy of China to prevent India from playing more proactive role on international level. Next is the US support to India. The Chinese government is anxious about increased cooperation between India and the United States of America. In the eyes of China, this partnership is part of US strategy of rebalancing towards Asia, that is, a move clearly directed against China. At the same time, China believes that US is using India as a counterweight to Chinese influence. Last important aspect in terms of conflict is India's membership to international organizations. Now, China has repeatedly blocked India's membership to international organizations such as United Nations Security Council, Nuclear Suppliers Group, etc. Membership of these organizations is quite critical for India. At the same time, when we talk about the Chinese standpoint in terms of these organizations and their membership, China has always opposed India's membership to these critical organizations. Now, when we talk about three C's of Indo-China relationship, which is cooperate, compete, and conflict, it can be safely said that China's strategy toward India is more of strategy for neutralization. This strategy has two important facets. First, preventing India from pursuing anti-China policies. Now, this can be seen from some of the examples in the recent past. First is the engagement in Vietnam. Now, India has postponed the exploration of oil block which was granted by Vietnam in the South China Sea due to Chinese pressure. In today's analysis, we have discussed about the kind of policy China has adopted in the case of South China Sea. The policy of China does not look prudent and it is not in consonance with the cooperative existence. At the same time, China has given preference to its national interests to such an extent that it is willing to subdue its smaller neighbors. Second important aspect in this case is naval exercises. India had planned to include Australia in the annual Malabar naval exercises. Presently, the naval exercises include the navies of India, Japan, and USA. However, due to Chinese pressure, India did not send an invitation to Australia to join naval exercises. Now we can see that China has continuously increased its pressure in the Indian Ocean region. It has developed many ports, at the same time has stationed its naval forces as well. At the same time in this process, China has also contained India's activity in this region. Next important aspect is India's membership to Quad. China was opposed to India's inclusion in the Quad security dialogue, which includes USA, Japan, and Australia. India initially rejected to be part of the Quad, but later it decided to join this grouping in spite of the Chinese concerns. Apart from that, some of the Chinese policy can be seen as anti India in its nature. First, involvement in the CPEC, especially in the Pakistan occupied Kashmir. Second is opposition to India's membership in the United Nations Security Council and Nuclear Supplier Group. And then support to Pakistan, as we have seen that Pakistan has got undue support from China, especially after revoking the statehood of Jammu and Kashmir. In this context, we need to understand the kind of policies that China has adopted against India. At the same time, we need to cooperate and integrate as well in terms of finding the right balance between growth and conflict. Page number 1 of today's newspaper presents a news item which talks about three quasi-subspecies of virus in circulation. Now, this topic is important more from the perspective of the prelims examination and it will come under general science. Now, we need to understand what is the importance of identifying the quasi-subspecies of virus in circulation. For this particular purpose, we have identified four important points on which we should discuss. The first is a mixture of three quasi-subspecies of SARS-CoV-2, that is COVID-19, are in circulation in India. Now we need to understand why this is important. The first and foremost reason is that virus has a tendency to mutate. And once virus mutates, it changes its form in terms of its expression as well. Now once its expression is changed, it also causes variation in symptoms as well as the severity of the disease. This may cause changes in other features of the disease as well in terms of the contagious nature of the disease or even the impact on body organs. So what this news highlights is the kind of subspecies of virus which are found in India is similar to what we have seen in the global level. It leads to a very simple observation that all the subspecies of the virus are of imported category and there is no variation from the place of their origin. Now we need to understand why this particular piece of information is important for us. First, when we know that the subspecies of virus are same as that of their imported varieties, it means that the existing knowledge that we have about the virus is sufficient to identify in terms of symptoms and then to ensure treatment for the same. Now this basically ensures that the kind of collaboration we are going to enter with various nations, this is going to benefit India as well. If there are local strains of virus available, then this kind of international collaboration in terms of sharing of knowledge, understanding of the treatment and collaboration would have been far more difficult. And this would have also caused additional burden on the government to make treatment available for those who are infected by the local varieties of these virus. At the same time, it is important for us to understand that so far scientists have not been in a position to classify as an Indian strain. At the same time, we need to understand that this does not mean that there has been no local variation in coronavirus. Why this is so? Because there are some cases in India where people had no travel history and yet they were found to be infected by coronavirus. Now we need to understand that all those people who get infected by this coronavirus, even when they haven't traveled abroad, it means that these people who had no travel history, if they got infection, they must have got infection from someone who has gone abroad. At the same time, the possibility of having a local variation of coronavirus is still possible. Now this is something that we need to understand, that this is very important aspect. Virus has a tendency to mutate according to the climatic condition of a particular region as well. So we need to understand that this coronavirus, if it has mutated in India, we need to have a proper understanding of that, as it is important in channelizing our effort in fighting against this coronavirus disease. In this context, this news is very important from the perspective of your understanding for the coronavirus impact. Now, by now, you must be aware of the fact that we have stopped the discussion of multiple choice questions in the Daily News Simplified video. In this context, we have highlighted that there is prelims quiz as well. Now, when we talk about the prelims quiz, there are multiple benefits in this case. Suppose this is the question of the previous day and you choose an answer, and there is a solution as well, which can actually help you in performing better in terms of making notes as well. This is something which is a very handy tool, especially in terms of the coming examination. And what you can do, you can go for the next question, select an option, and ultimately see what has been the problem in terms of identifying the mistake. There are much more details that are highlighted in this solution. Once you have completed the entire thing, you can submit and you can see how well you have performed in the entire exercise. We at RAU'S believe that this is a better mechanism through which we can check how well you have prepared for the examination. At the same time, the right time to attempt for the prelims quiz is after you have attended the DNS session. With this, we have come to the end of today's session. Let's move to the question of the day. Question of the day reads, Parasols and sprattles which has been seen in the news relate to which of the following? Option A reads, antigens identified to fight malaria. Option B, proteins for gene editing. Option C, islands in South China Sea. And option D, none of the above.